weather has been great. You've had a lot of fun with your aircraft. But the cost of your flying has been rising like so many other things these days. Maybe today is the day you're going to look into that preventive maintenance thing you read about and the other people at the airport have been talking about. How do you get started on a good preventive maintenance program? There are all those FAA rules you don't really understand, and your mechanic hasn't been too encouraging either. So, where do you begin? A good start for your program of preventive maintenance is a walk-around inspection, followed by a thorough cleaning using the manufacturer's recommended cleaning compounds. You should consider waxing and polishing the airplane, first making sure that you are using a good wax that will maintain a gloss for several months. Check the airframe for corrosion, evidence of fluid leaks, cracks in the airplane's skin, the condition of struts, and any other external bracing. Also check the condition of all the flight control and engine control systems, all the way back to the cockpit. Damage to fabric surfaces. And finally, check for varmints such as field mice, birds, bees, wasps, squirrels, chipmunks, and even snakes. You are most likely to find corrosion, cracks, and damaged rivets and fasteners in various locations. These may vary from one design to another. There is separate video available from your safety program manager at your local FAASTeam that discusses this in depth. Corrosion Control Part 1. During your walk-around and cleaning, be especially observant for loose or missing fasteners. You are permitted to remove and replace non-structural standard fasteners. Remember, you must use only the approved fasteners, screws, and rivets for your aircraft. If you have the experience and the equipment required to perform this task, have at it. Buck those rivets. Otherwise, leave it to your mechanic. An incorrectly driven rivet is difficult to remove without damaging the sheet metal around the rivet. Cracks in the cowling are most likely to appear around rivet holes and fasteners, and at points where the sheet metal has been radiused for a form fit. Pilots are permitted to remove and replace cowlings and cowl flaps on the aircraft they own and operate, as long as this can be done without removing the propeller. Only certified mechanics may remove a propeller. When removing the cowling from your aircraft, it is recommended that you obtain assistance. Remember, the cowling is an expensive piece of sheet metal or composite material. It is quickly scratched and its appearance easily spoiled. Set it down on a clean surface where it won't get damaged, and don't leave the engine uncovered for extended periods of time. You should not run the engine with the cowling off, since it is vital to the proper circulation of cooling air around the cylinders. Before replacing it, clean it thoroughly inside and out, and have any necessary repairs made, or do them yourself, so long as they fall within the class of repairs authorized in Appendix A of FAR 43, describing preventive maintenance activities permitted for owner pilots. If you are going to lubricate moving parts on your airplane, first refer to the lubrication section of your service manual for the correct type of lubricant and how to apply it. Also check with your A&P mechanic before getting started. Note, many of today's aircraft have Teflon-coated control surface hinges that must not be treated with any lubricant. Now let's take a look at changing fluids and filters. You'll need the following tools to accomplish these tasks. 1. A funnel, a length of hose, and a bucket to collect the waste oil. 2. Wire cutters to remove the safety wire from the oil filter. 3. A combination wrench to loosen the oil and fuel filter, or better yet, a box end wrench of the proper size. 4. Safety wire pliers or common pliers to replace the required safety wire when the task is completed. 5. A calibrated torque wrench, 0 to 100 foot-pounds to properly secure the oil filter. 6. Oil filter cutting tool and magnet. And 7. The appropriate manufacturer's maintenance manual. It is important that you keep fuel and oil filters and strainers in a good operating condition. Regular maintenance of the filters, screens, and strainers is the key to avoiding degradation of lubrication, reduction of contaminants, and loss of engine performance. These are basic preventive maintenance tasks and clearly explained in the manufacturer's maintenance manual. Change oil with the engine warm, but not hot, so the oil will flow freely. Follow the service manual instructions when cleaning or replacing fuel, oil, induction air, and vacuum filter elements. Only approved strainers and filters should be used when you replace them. Items from automobile parts stores are not approved and should not be used. Examine the engine oil suction screen for the presence of metal particles and inspect the external full-flow oil filter for metal particles by cutting it open so that the pleated element can be unfolded and examined with a magnet for ferrous metal particles. Be sure to use the cutting tool designed for the purpose when you cut the filter open. Any tool with teeth, such as a hacksaw, is absolutely unsuitable since it creates metal particles. You should check with your mechanic for all ADs that apply to your airplane. As an example, AD 842602 requires replacement of the paper induction filter before accumulating 500 hours time in service. Note, this does not alter current maintenance and inspection requirements. It applies to all induction air filters made of paper and used in small airplanes. You are allowed to change the filter, but only an A&P mechanic can sign off the AD and return the airplane to service. Use approved safety wire. Refer to your service manual for the correct gauge for each application. Always apply safety wire so that it will cause the item to be tightened. When several nuts or bolt heads are wired in series, the wiring should be such that if any bolt head starts to back off, that action tends to tighten the bolts next to it. Make the final pigtail and clip it off. Protect your eyes from flying wire and make sure that the scrap pieces end up in the trash. Follow the example demonstrated here. Now, to meet the FAA requirements, you need to make an appropriate entry in your airframe logbook. This should include the date, total airframe hours, a description of the work you performed, followed with your signature, your rating, and certificate number. If you have multiple maintenance records, you may elect to place the entry in your engine log. However, you can never go wrong by placing the entry in the airframe record. Remember that once you begin preventive maintenance, you are bound by the regulations in FAR Part 43 and especially 43.13 performance rules. The changing of spark plugs is the next task that you might consider performing. The tools required to do this task are 1. Combination wrenches 7/8 and 7/16. 2. Ratchet wrench and spark plug deep well socket. 3. Spark plug gapping tool appropriate to the plugs installed in your aircraft. 4. Applicable go, no-go gauge. 5. Thread lubricant and anti-seize compound. And 6. The appropriate maintenance manual. Some of the important items to bear in mind when cleaning spark plugs and setting the gap and replacing them are: always start with a recently calibrated torque wrench. Use the torque wrench only for tightening the plugs. Using it to remove them is unnecessary and may put it out of calibration. Use the correct plugs for your engine. Do not assume that the ones currently installed are correct, even if you did the last plug change yourself. The manufacturers do change the recommended plug applications, and it may affect your aircraft. Before removing or even loosening any plug, make sure that the well that it sits in is absolutely free of any loose grit or other debris. Don't leave the plug hole open any longer than you absolutely have to. You don't want anything to fall into the cylinder. Cleaning spark plugs will not be addressed because of the cost of the equipment required to do this task. Always use a fresh washer under the plug anytime you replace the plugs. Again, to meet the FAA requirements, you need to make an appropriate entry in your airframe logbook. This should include the date, total airframe hours, a description of the work you performed, followed with your signature, your rating, and certificate number. The next thing you want to consider is the replacement of prefabricated fuel lines. This again is a task where you'll want to evaluate your skills and mechanical knowledge. Check the owner's manual for guidance, because the decision on whether or not to do this yourself should be based on knowledge of the system. The simplest possible system Gravity-fed with a normal aspirated and carbureted engine should not present any problems. If the fuel system is pressurized, whether the engine is normally carbureted or fuel injected, this calls for special procedures, and you should be very careful before attempting this task. Check with your mechanic before doing anything. There's a good chance that the task needs to be performed by him. When you are dealing with a simple engine and fuel system, there's no great difficulty attached to replacing a fuel line. It is very important to align everything to avoid cross-threading the couplings as you prepare to tighten them. Always check a fuel line in the highest normal pressure condition. In the case of a tailwheel aircraft with a gravity-feed fuel system, the aircraft should be in a level flight attitude with the fuel selector in the open position. For a low-wing aircraft, it should be checked with the boost pump on. The highest pressure condition is not necessarily obtained with the engine running. A final word on fuel line replacement. It is imperative that you replace fuel lines with properly approved replacements. No exceptions. Finally, you can replace any hose connection on your airplane except in the hydraulic lines. Don't forget to make a logbook entry. Topping off the brake fluid is a simple task on most airplanes, but before you get started, check the service manual for your airplane. Even though the job is basically simple, you should still be very careful, as it is vital that no foreign material finds its way into the hydraulics. Be sure that you use the correct fluid and that it is scrupulously clean. Any funnels that you may use must be spotless, and before you remove the cap of any brake fluid reservoir, wipe the area around it so that it is absolutely clean and nothing can fall into the fluid. Specks of grit can scratch the polished surfaces inside the master and slave cylinders and cause leaks to develop, while the wrong fluid will cause damage to seals, O-rings, and the like. Top off the fluid to the right level. Do not overfill. On most airplanes, the brake reservoir is on the firewall and readily accessible. If your airplane has a retractable landing gear, there is a separate fluid reservoir for that system, and where the reservoir is located varies from type to type. In many cases, it is against the wall in the baggage compartment. The same precautions apply, and it is just as important to keep the fluid level up to the mark. Now, to meet the FAA requirements, you need to make an appropriate entry in your airframe logbook. The next area to be covered is the replacement of bulbs, reflectors, and lenses. You may replace bulbs, reflectors, and lenses of your airplane's position, landing, and anti-collision lights. These are simple tasks that nonetheless must be performed very carefully. Be very sure when replacing bulbs that you are using the correct bulb for each application. Bulbs can look alike, but actually be different. Look-alike bulbs are not interchangeable. Refer to your airplane service manual for bulb specifications. Lenses must be of the correct color, and when replacing them, you should make sure of this. And when securing them in place, use a fresh gasket to make sure that moisture does not leak in. When you have finished, check for correct operation. Remember to meet the FAA requirements and make an appropriate entry in your airframe logbook. The removal of your landing gear wheels and tires will be the next area you might wish to consider. Although this appears to be a simple task, the correct tools and some pre-planning will help make the job go smoother. Read the maintenance manual before you begin and make sure you have the necessary jacks and tools for your particular aircraft. First, remove the old cotter pins from the nut retaining one of the main landing gear wheels. Be careful not to leave the old pins on the hangar floor where they could be picked up by a tire and eventually cause damage to the carcass. Replacing tires and inner tubes is not an easy task, even with a split wheel. Before loosening the nuts holding the wheel halves together, completely deflate the tire and remove the valve core. Loosen the retaining nuts progressively, and finally, break the wheel halves apart. When replacing the tube, dust the interior of the tire carcass with talcum powder to act as a lubricant so that the tire can inflate smoothly. When tightening the wheel retaining bolts, do a little at a time on each nut in an alternating pattern so that no one nut gets tightened too far ahead of the others. Failure to observe this could result in a cracked wheel. Finally, check the tire pressure and use a soap solution around the valve to make sure that the valve stem is not leaking. When putting in the new cotter pins, they must be rotated so that the head fits snugly into the castellations before the cotter pin is firmly pulled through and the ends folded back. Remember to trim off the excess length. This must be done carefully to avoid having the ends of the pin fly out, get lost on the floor, or strike you in the eye. These are valid cautions. When tightening a castellated nut, you may find that the specified torque is reached and none of the castellations on the nut line up with the cotter keyhole in the bolt. Tighten or loosen the nut the minimum amount necessary to permit you to insert the cotter key. Finally, only use aircraft quality hardware. Once again, don't forget to make the maintenance logbook entry. The removal, replacement, and servicing of batteries is another area which you are allowed to do. It sounds sort of like a broken record, but the first thing to do is check your maintenance manual to determine the correct battery required for your airplane. You may top off the acid level with distilled water, but be careful not to overfill the cells. Follow the directions in your manual and any directions that come with the battery. If you want to charge the battery without removing it from the airplane, follow the directions in your manual. Be very careful to follow the correct procedure and observe the polarities of the terminals. The final connection can create a spark, and since lead-acid batteries generate hydrogen, there is a chance of an explosion, especially if the battery is in a confined space, as it is on an airplane. If you have to connect both terminals of the charger to the battery terminals, make these connections before beginning the charging process. You can also remove the battery to charge it. This will give you a chance to inspect, clean, and treat the battery box and the surrounding area with baking soda to neutralize any acid present and prevent any further corrosion. Always keep the terminals clean and treat them with an approved protective grease to prevent corrosion. You may also replace the emergency locator transmitter battery following the manufacturer's instructions. Don't forget to enter the new expiration date into the maintenance record and to mark it legibly on the transmitter case. Remember, the job is not done until the paperwork is completed. Two recent changes to the regulations now make it possible for you to remove and replace self-contained front instrument panel mounted communication devices that use tray-mounted connectors. This is a very simple operation that requires just a little care to keep the unit properly aligned when replacing it. Front panel mounted navigational devices can be removed for updating air traffic control navigational software databases or to exchange a defective unit. You can remove and reinstall approved aircraft cabin seats. You may replace your seat belts and shoulder harnesses with parts approved for your make and model of airplane. Follow your service manual instructions carefully. This is a safety of flight item and must be done properly. Be sure to use the correct spacers and washers wherever these are called for. Lock nuts in this application are often of the nylon insert type. Always use new ones when reinstalling the new belts and harnesses. Remember, aircraft seats are designed for specific applications, and you should not attempt to modify them to make them stronger or more rigid. We have covered only a few basic items which you are allowed to perform under preventive maintenance. The complete listing is found in Appendix A of FAR Part 43. You're expected to perform the work in a professional manner and record all the work you do in your maintenance log as per Advisory Circular 43.9b. Logging your preventive maintenance tasks is not only required by the regulations, it can also save you money. Unrecorded maintenance tasks are not required to be accepted by your mechanic. Your mechanic is required to perform work you may have already completed if it is required for an annual or special inspection. Your word is not your bond unless it is in the logbook. Realistically, if you are purchasing your aircraft from an unknown party, you would appreciate knowing that the aircraft received an extra dose of TLC. That's preventive maintenance in a nutshell. Now, the choice is yours.